Hello everybody, thanks for taking the time to join this webinar. My name is Julian Boneham, and during this session we're going to have a look at the changing landscape of database management and what this means to the data operations team. So first of all, we have to consider the volumes of data that are now being generated by businesses. And of course, data's always been expanding ever since businesses started to deploy applications, and particularly online applications. There's been that steady growth of data and so on. But really what's changed significantly over the last 10 years certainly has been the absolute increase and rapid increase in terms of the growth of that data. But it's not just the growth and size of that data that's causing an impact, it's the type of data that's now being generated. So in the past, data has largely been structured, so it's been relatively easy to put that data into a nice, neat relational database model where you can put all the entries into that rows and columns type model. Whereas now, a lot of the data that's being generated is unstructured or semi-structured type data. So this is causing a challenge in terms of location of where the data is being generated, because often this is maybe social media type posts and that data is being generated and then stored at the edge of the infrastructure and not necessarily within the central data center environment. But it's also, how does that data get interrogated? How do you get value out of that data? Because where it's semi-structured or unstructured, maybe it's a PDF file or an audio file, for example. So it introduces a new challenge in terms of how to gain insights from that data, which of course all introduces a challenge to businesses in terms of what technologies do they use for managing this data, and also the location of this data. Where is it best stored? Is it best within a private environment or maybe within a public cloud environment? So all of this kind of changing dynamic of size of data is impacting on businesses in terms of how they then manage their data. So from a Node 4 point of view, and if we look at the technologies that we're largely supporting, of course, there's loads and loads of SQL Server, there's loads of Oracle, and also a reasonable amount of MySQL. So there's a lot of that relational database type work that we're delivering. And if we looked at a Gartner Magic Quadrant going back 10 years, we'd see up in that top right corner, there'd be Oracle, there'd be Microsoft SQL Server, there'd be DB2 as well. And that's probably pretty static. That's how it would have looked for a long period of time, as those relational databases really kind of owned that enterprise space. But what's happened over the last number of years has been the advent of new technologies that have been developed specifically to help businesses cope with this big increase in data. And it's been this terminology, big data, that businesses are trying to contend with. So just calling out a couple of the NoSQL vendors that have really got quite a strong referenceability now within the enterprise space. Couchbase and MongoDB, we do a reasonable amount of work with those technologies. Couchbase, for example, is a really useful product if you've got a load of data and you need to have a strong caching layer at the front end of the system. And so that Couchbase database can either be used in isolation or maybe sitting in front of an existing big data store or data mart. And having that, that blend of technology, of course, then introduces a further challenge to businesses in terms of how do they best manage this evolving and increasing mix of technologies. It's difficult to find the skills, and particularly where the majority of these systems, they need to be available on a 24/7 basis. They need to be highly performant because they're driving web applications and so on. So it's all introducing an additional set of challenges to businesses. I think what's really interesting is also the advent of the cloud-native databases. So within AWS, there's Aurora, and Microsoft Azure, there's the Cosmos DB database. And these databases are built specifically for use within public cloud environments. So what's interesting, of course, is by definition, they're geographically scalable because of the location. So really useful for businesses that have got that geographical spread. But really importantly, they've got pretty much unlimited scalability within the databases as to the ability then to cope with large peaks and troughs of usage, for example. So particularly, imagine a retail type organization and you've got the sales periods, and you need to have that extra compute power. That type of ability to flex systems up and down is really, really powerful. So within those cloud-native databases, there are already useful migration tools that exist to help to move existing data workloads, relational data workloads, into those products. So Aurora, for example, really useful tools around migrating existing MySQL workloads, or Cosmos DB moving SQL Server database workloads. But as those migration tools become more mature and more kind of accepted within the marketplace, I think we'll see more and more traditional data workloads starting to move across into those public cloud databases. So in terms of the service model around that data operations team, of course, it's an absolute imperative that you've got really strong service integration and help desk and the ability to manage incidents on a 24/7 basis. That needs to be married up with really good quality monitoring services so that you're getting the insight back in terms of when systems need to be tuned and when you're identifying issues and so on. But all those things are a given, and frankly, they've been part of that managed service model for years and years now. But what we're seeing really change, particularly over the last couple of years, is that drive to be much more proactive in terms of the service model. And this has been driven by the speed at which systems are changing now within customer environments and velocity of application code change, for example. So from what was a typical service level agreement and responding to issues when they come in, nowadays it's much more important that there's actually a proactive level of support that's delivered against the systems, just so that it's helping to keep on top of the systems and be able to drive performance in the context of loads and loads of change happening often above that of the application layer as the speed of those changes becomes ever more important. So that level of proactiveness around the service level is really, really apparent now. And in terms of what makes the success of the managed service from a data operations point of view, what we find is it's invariably all driven from the initial onboarding type work. So, of course, there's always going to need to be a full review of systems and health check reports and documentation and so on. But it's so important that actual work then gets actioned in terms of seeing through all the recommendations that are made. So there needs to be a really detailed remediation plan that gets agreed for each of the systems, making sure then that those systems do get fully optimized from the outset of the data operations managed service, and that then there's a collective agreement between the data operations team, the rest of the business, as to how those systems are fully optimized from the outset. And from that point, of course, it then goes into being able to deliver that iterative tuning type work, making sure that you're delivering the managed service off a really strong baseline of performance against those systems. And that ultimately then enables the systems to remain highly performant, highly available, and in the best condition possible. So really, really important to pin down that onboarding process, make sure that service integration works effectively from the earliest stage possible, so that those systems are all, we're collectively agreed, they're in the best state possible. The other area that we're seeing more and more of now, and this is really relevant in the context of transformation of IT, and as per the series of webinars that Node4 are running, is the request for what we would term strategic type consulting. So I don't mean the consulting work that's the traditional, we need to upgrade or need to add in an additional server, for example. But the type of consultancy work that's really transforming the systems and driving change across the database estate. So often, particularly with customers that have been around for a period of time, and there's a reasonable amount of technical debt that exists within those systems, there's so often a good opportunity for consolidating those environments, getting them into a more manageable state, and frankly reducing down some of the license costs and infrastructure costs as well. And we see that time and time again. That's a natural symptom of how systems grow over time. So there's often a need for that consolidation of systems. Equally, there may be an opportunity for putting in data warehousing and aggregating lots of different data sources, for example. And certainly very, very frequently we're seeing that drive now for customers in terms of moving databases into different platforms and looking at a hybrid type model in terms of where that infrastructure best sits. And that loops back to what I mentioned earlier around a lot of the data now is being created outside of that core data center type model. So that then leads into the opportunity to use different database products to help manage and retain all of that data in an appropriate way. The next area that we're seeing as being an absolute imperative in terms of that data operations model is the way that security is knitted into that service model. And of course, from a data operations point of view, ISO 27000 has frankly been a prerequisite for many years now because it shows the right level of governance around processes, access control, people management and so on. So having an ISO 27000 accreditation is an absolute prerequisite, but what we're seeing now, particularly with the advent of GDPR and where data governance has become much more of a board level responsibility, the need to have the security operations centre closely aligned with the data operations team is really, really important. And it's particularly relevant where a lot of systems now, they're sitting across multiple platforms. So some systems may be on-premise or within a managed data center operation or in a public cloud environment. So there's inherently a potential risk around opening up vulnerabilities because spanning across different networks and different infrastructures. So having that security overlay in terms of ensuring that every service model that we put in place has a level of sign-off from the security and compliance manager, really, really important. And we're seeing that more and more now within all of the data operations services that we're delivering. As to the trends that we're seeing from a data operations point of view, I've mentioned that we're seeing certainly bigger volumes of data and the challenge that businesses see as to where that data is best located. It's also worth highlighting that data is viewed to be more and more critical now from a business point of view. So critical not just in the sense of needing to retain that data from a compliance point of view, but critical in terms of the value of that data and how businesses can derive competitive advantage from that data in really ensuring that it's there, it's available, it can be analysed for the value of the data that's held for the business. And stemming from that, a couple of the trends that we're certainly seeing a lot more automation now within the data operations team. And whilst this has been a trend for many, many years, and it's always been a sort of like a goal within the data operations world, the reality is now that there's something a lot more tangible and viable that businesses are actually able to access from an automation point of view. So think of Oracle and 19C and the autonomous database that's now available from Oracle. So it's a great advancement in terms of the database development because it's really helping businesses to abstract themselves away from a lot of the traditional DBA tasks around performance tuning and space management and those traditional tasks which are labour intensive for a business. Same applies to SQL Server sitting up in Azure and the PaaS-based services that are available. Again, all designed to help abstract the customer away from having to worry about anything infrastructure related or again, any kind of versioning control and so on. So really, really useful advances now in automation. And I'm sure that we're just going to see that continuation as a trend now as it's enabling businesses to really focus on the business generative type work and not have to worry about the more sort of administration type tasks, which have traditionally been part of that database management type world. Also, we're seeing more and more hybrid environments now, and this isn't so much a trend because I think, frankly, it's been a trend for a number of years now. But what's changed over the last few years is that it's becoming much more the norm in terms of businesses looking at how they can pluck out some of their applications and move them into Azure or AWS, for example. So we'll see more and more of this as businesses go through that cycle of modernising their systems and their applications. And in the past where businesses may have been seen as quite forward-looking if they were going to move production workloads into a public cloud provider. I think that's much more of the norm now. It's certainly what we're seeing across the mid-market customers and enterprise space that we work with within Node 4. So there's that drive towards working across these multiple platforms, whether it's on-premise or third-party data center or within a public cloud type platform. And then finally, in terms of the other big trend that we're seeing, it's the data analytics. And this is it's where businesses now are able to really derive the value from the data that's sitting across their system. So what we're seeing more and more of now, and it's I think with the context of analytics, there's always been that business intelligence requirement that sits alongside the data operations team. But in the past, that's largely been a separated function in terms of skill set and software and technology that's helped businesses to really pull together that business intelligence. Whereas what's changed and what's available now is that there are these centralized capabilities around analytics. So looking at Azure, for example, and using Data Factory and Databricks, and then being able to pull together the data from multiple different data pipelines and aggregating all of that data into a central repository, overlay Power BI to present back insightful reports and so on. It's really, really powerful, and that's enabling the data operations team to really drive forward that modern data warehouse. Whereas in the past, that would have been a skill set that would have been very much separated out of that traditional DBA type world. So the advancement around the technologies, whether that's Azure or another platform, and the ability to build in that analytics platform as part of the data operations team is certainly something that we'll see more and more of, because ultimately that's where businesses are driving that data operations model. It's ultimately what value can you get out of the data to help give competitive advantage around all of that information that's coming into the business. So what does all this mean for the actual DBA role? Well, there's been loads and loads of articles written over the last few years around the end is nigh for the DBA, and DBAs are going to become superfluous to requirements and so on. But in our experience and what we've seen over the last few years, and we've really kind of refocused our attention into being more of a data operations team rather than a traditional DBA team, because frankly, they do so much more than just that traditional DBA role of space management, backup management and tuning and so on. There's a lot more to it now in terms of looking at the overall solution of the database technology and where it resides and so on. So what we're seeing is that DBA role is really just getting redefined and reshaped as opposed to becoming more sidelined. So just calling out a couple of the roles that we're seeing being developed. As a data engineer, and this is really where it's a given now that DBAs need to be able to operate across multiple different platforms and be conversant in terms of how to implement and manage across public cloud platforms in the same way as they would do against private infrastructure. It's also the ability within that data engineering role to be able to create those data pipelines so they feed into the data warehouse and being able to help aggregate all of these different sources of information into a relevant central repository. There's also the data scientist role, and this is something completely new, frankly, in terms of IT administration. Data scientist is much more of a mathematical role or a functional role in terms of being able to visualize the data and being able to create that data model for a business so that they can ultimately drive the value. So it's a new addition to that data operations team, but it's going to get more and more important as businesses really need to understand how to best model that data and how to derive value from it. And that all feeds into that analytics type platforming. And then also there's the data architect role, and this kind of loops back to what I mentioned earlier around that strategic consulting type role. So the data architect, that role is going to be much more focused around actually choosing the correct technology mix for the environment, choosing the right platforms to where that data should be located, and ultimately how it can be best managed and consolidated and future-proofed for the best use within the business. So we're seeing loads of changes in terms of what the DBA role is actually delivering and how that role is reshaping. But frankly, that keeps it really interesting in terms of that whole data operations piece. It's making the role ultimately more beneficial to that whole overall sort of transformation of IT. So in terms of the future of the data operations team and where we see things fitting into that whole transformation of IT going forwards, well, first and foremost, there's an absolute need to kind of link in that data operations piece with the DevOps team. So where businesses are looking at re-architecting systems and working out where to host their systems from a re-platforming point of view, the decision around where to host systems is almost invariably driven by what the application is doing and how it's built and so on. So there has to be that intrinsic link between the data operations team and the DevOps team to help determine what the best location is for that system. So by knitting together those functions really closely, that gives an insight in terms of whether or not the workload is best suited to private infrastructure or public cloud infrastructure. And of course, that's a reality of here and now. There's a lot of applications that are built which, despite any great desire to move everything lock, stock and barrel into a public cloud environment, it's not yet possible to do that just due to the level of application refactoring or engineering that would need to happen to enable those applications to work effectively outside of private infrastructure. And hence the reason that we've got this model around hybrid environments, which is frankly what we're likely to see for the foreseeable future. And then thereafter, there's going to be the demand that retains around the really strong, robust service level agreement that's required across monitoring and performance tuning and responding to stuff at ever increasing frequency just due to the velocity of change that's happening at an application layer. And then knitting that together with the security operations team so that there's that really tight level of governance around the way in which the data operations team is working and how that fits into the data operator model and basically ensures data compliance for the end business. So ultimately that data operations team, we see it as being probably more important than ever in terms of transformation of IT, and ultimately it needs to link together that data operations team with the DevOps team, with the security operations team, and that then gives the cross-section of skills coupled with all of the different technologies that are now within the mix and different platforms and so on, and ultimately deliver that data operations model irrespective of where the platform is, because from an end business point of view, the requirement is to have that service level agreement that's seamless irrespective of whether those systems are on-premise or whether they're within a third-party data center or whether they're within a public cloud. There needs to be that service wrap that fits across all and helps to drive that value out of the data. So that was it in terms of the slides that I just wanted to cover today. I appreciate everyone's time today, but any questions, please send them in now.